Michael knew, with all of the magic he had at his disposal, which he would never entrust to anyone else, his group would be able to travel the fastest and farthest, so this is what they proceeded to do. He sent most groups to the major cities in Macadia, one in Rivermouth, one to Stone Garden, one to Nigamesh, two to Golgari, while his own went to Jorgweiser. The city resided in the zone of the beam's influence, and there magic was unpredictable and unwieldy. Magic was still heavily utilized by the upper classes, but it was bound in the more reliable form of stone and steel. Jorgweiser was the largest importer of the magical items and enchantments that Golgari was so known for making. Other than Thunderscrim, the city was the leader in all things analog and mechanical because of this. Or, now they were the first, but only because Thunderscrim had been sealed away in the largest demiplane and time-stop spell of all time 5 years before. Something about discovering that the prince of the country had the Ethereum shard within him, and then that he'd been kidnapped by wizards who were most assuredly using that mode of raw power of the universe for altruistic purposes. Michael hoped that someone would find him soon. That green rock was something everyone in the world wanted to get their hands on. Everyone in every other world, too. Maybe he could get lucky and Merkul could take it, rescuing the prince and his power from whatever plucky adventurers had rescued him from the wizards. But that was a quest for another day. But back to Jorgweiser. Michael enjoyed the city not for the Art Deco aesthetic and further advanced technology, but the enormous network of mafias, gangs, and black markets. If there was anywhere that Michael could make use of Stephen's nose, it was here. The first thing on his list was contacting an old associate, most deliciously one who owed him a big favor. Their name was Raphael de Glade, and they were a salesman for their family. Michael had gotten him out of hell once. Literally. The man genuinely owed him an eternal life debt, and Raphael was keenly aware that Michael could almost effortlessly take him right back to hell. That in mind, Raphael was a more than gracious host, never mind their 14-strong party. After a quick sending spell, Raphael arranged for a wizard under the de Glade family banner to teleport them to a de Glade safe house. Once notified of this, the patron of the family, Don Luca de Glade, invited all of them to his manor for a dinner. Michael was actually only going to bring Lewis as a plus one. He did not trust the others to not make a scene should any of the de Glade soldiers get more anxious than the champion of the apocalypse god visiting already made them. Not even the strongest mafia or a whole host of them had a chance of stopping Michael and crew. It was just that a fight of that caliber would attract far too much attention of the kind of people who could stop them. It was more than Michael had expected in the first place. He didn't want to impose. On the Don, Raphael owed him his soul. Michael was intending to take all the man had down to his shoes if that was going to help them in any way. Michael wasn't even sure that Don even knew about Raphael's little adventure and assisted escape. It didn't really matter if he had known about it before now or not, though. Either Raphael was important enough to the mafia boss that he was going to put up with apocalypse cultists, or the Don just wanted Michael there so he could refund Raphael's soul to Michael personally. If that was the case, Michael knew just who to sell it to, and through that person, acquire adequate lodging and supplies. He was tempted to just kidnap Raphael and return him to hell outright. The digs weren't that impressive. But he figured if nothing else, he could use the DeGlades for all they were worth and then make a profit off the gangster too when their stay ran out. So all in short, he left the other 12 of their gaggle at the lone safe house, but told them not to unpack or doff their armor yet. Stephen couldn't help but gawk at the 4th building he'd been inside of. This building even had whitewashed stone walls and opaque glass windows, not to mention, most luxuriously, an indoor toilet. Stephen had never seen one before, and most of the others had only been around them once or twice, but they all shared a laugh at Stephen's amazement as they showed him how it worked. Without actually using it yet, Claire made sure to insist. Claire didn't like wasting perfectly clean water after years of fretting about parasites in the swamp, but without Michael there to scold him or Louis there to mock him, she let the others have their innocent, even if childish, amusement. Louis's taunts and outright disgust for her boy enraged Claire to no end, but she had followed the wise old Lovin Khan's advice. Stephen had no idea that the mean words Louis constantly said were insults, so the easiest way to combat the irritating warlock was to never tell Stephen that he was being insulted. If Claire never reacted to them, then Stephen would never learn that they were something to be reacted to. A bully like Louis thrived on people's reactions, so he might get bored or even less confident in his ability to antagonize if it all rolled off the young paladin's shoulders. Following Michael's commands, they only minimally unpacked. Claire helped Stephen onto the first sofa he'd ever seen or sat on, and they all oohed and awed at the foreign food stocked up in the safe house's cellar and pantry. After all, if Michael and Louis were going to a dinner with their host, why should they not indulge in a feast as well? White and red wine, a cask of beer, dried noodles of every shape they could imagine, hard salami and cheeses, wafery crackers, potted meats, along with all manner of fruits and vegetables in jars. This was when they fully explored that there was nothing in the world that Stephen would not eat, so long as someone informed him that it was food. Claire had long worried about it. She had seen Stephen try to eat grass, and had stopped him on numerous occasions just before his lips closed around poisonous berries or mushrooms. It all started when they found a jar of anchovies, and went around daring each other to eat one alone and raw. With great drama, Don, not a mafia man, his name was just Don, held the oily sliver of painfully salty fish by the smallest tip of his fingers, trying not to touch even a molecule more than he had to, and mostly by the coarse, hair-like bones, to avoid getting the intense aroma any deeper into his skin than was absolutely necessary. Only after this, Toxic suggested using a fork. Not surrendering, especially not after the laugh they all had at the expense of Don's now smelly hand. He lifted the wet meat to the sky with all of the zeal of raising a dagger over a holy sacrifice, and with just as much drama he lowered the morsel to his lips and sucked it down with the same force that someone might spit up phlegm before he sputtered and choked and gagged. The anchovy didn't even have time to properly graze his tongue, but it was just that he couldn't have gotten any closer to inhaling it if he had tried. Already his cough smelled like fish, and after another good minute of laughter, the others simmered down enough to hand Don a mug of beer to wash it down. No one else was eager to try after this. especially since none of them had wanted to in the first place. But wanting to make his misery seem less foolish, Don went around insisting. Still afraid to even mention he was hungry, let alone ask for food, Stephen had not volunteered himself, but when Don offered, Stephen plucked the strip of meat off the fork with his remaining fingers, to which everyone laughed and facepalmed, and then chewed it with his remaining teeth, swallowing the bony, salty blob without so much as a blink. Don and the others blinked, however, and after a moment to take in the wonder, Don handed Stephen the rest of the jar, and within a minute it was empty. They offered Stephen a pickled onion, sauerkraut, a whole clove of garlic, which Stephen ate paper and all before Claire could stop him, blue cheese, a dried chili pepper, pickled snails, jarred pig's feet, a shot of vinegar, full spoonfuls of spices. Claire only stopped them when Thera suggested a cricket that had died and dried out on the corner of a windowsill. "That ain't to eat," the girl told the entire group with a severe sternness. She had been hungry enough to eat bugs before. Stephen certainly had. But she wasn't going to let him while they had other options. "It's not?" Stephen asked. Hand paused, halfway reaching for it. He glanced after it even as Claire picked up the long-dead bug and threw it away in the kitchen trash bin. "No, not food," Claire confirmed. She thought about lying and saying it was poisonous, but she preferred that Stephen one day stoop to eating a bug again if he had to, rather than starve to death. Though, on the other hand, it was unlikely that Stephen would remember this lie, especially not when hungry. "A delicacy in San Corral," Farah giggled. "If we ever go there, we can see," Claire scolded, even though she couldn't help but smile again after this, even as she rolled her eyes, when the others started to scheme on how to acquire raw oysters for Stephen to try. Elder Michael eventually returned with the good news that they could comfortably stay. The mafioso had been so cordial and welcoming, both in part because the champion of Mercoul was not someone to be a poor host to, and the family was still in the business that had gotten Raphael into hell in the first place, to the point where Don Luca de Glade had now gotten himself into the same sort of trouble personally. So Michael and crew could now stay as long as they wanted, and the de Glade family would outfit them as best as they reasonably could, if Michael promised to help Don de Glade negotiate with Asmodeus's taxman when he was set to come calling in a few weeks. How fortunate that our schedules had serendipitously worked out that way. It was serendipity, too. Michael wasn't even sure that he'd ever heard the minor devil's name before. He had made it clear that he couldn't guarantee that Don would come out with any sort of profit at all, especially because it would be a renegotiation of a contract that the Don had already broken and was in default for. But he promised that he would do what he could to at least keep the Don's soul in place. That didn't at all mean that the taxman would ever go away empty-handed when something so valuable as a soul was on the collections list, but Don de Glade might soon have to decide which of his lovers or children he liked the least. After acquiring this most certain confirmation that they could trust Michael's contact, the patron was certainly not going to find anyone else to save him, the group unwound so hard that they all but came apart at the seams. By the end of the night, they were all bathed. Even those who were sleeping on the floor were wrapped in clean linen and brand new, even if ill-fitting clothing that the Mafia had delivered, promising to send someone with a measuring tape by to acquire better clothes that they could blend into the city with. All were so fat off the charcuterie and drunk off the wine that Michael indulged them and let them sleep until it was nearly lunchtime the next day. Without the crackle of their fires, the snapping of their tent flaps in the wind, the shuffling and snoring of the 100 other death fists and their dozens of pack animals, The safe house was jarringly quiet. Claire and Stephen were sitting on the floor of a room with 2 beds. Lovin Khan was in one and Toxic in the other. Even on the floor, they were cozy, though. A stack of down blankets and pillows with Stephen glued to her, as always. Claire was uncomfortable, though, at the sound of Michael's voice coming through the walls while he was complimenting how well Louis had cleaned up before the dinner, even though the clothes he was wearing were the ones Louis wore almost every day. Through the walls, she also heard the thankfully more vague but still very uncomfortable sounds of Michael taking off these clothes Louis had been wearing. But then Stephen and Lovin Khan turned, as they also heard the sound but did not fully wake from sleep, and Claire was overjoyed as the noise of the warlock and demon champion was completely drowned out by harmonious snoring. Stephen always a bit with his odd mouth and malformed nose, and Lovin Khan as a supremely old man who was just incredibly and openly tired. This was so loud that it woke Toxic, but as Toxic looked over in bewilderment while the 2 male companions sawed wood beside them, she and Claire shared a silent laugh before they were sung to sleep by the sound of flapping nasal passages. First thing in the morning, as he would every morning for the next several months, Michael took in daily reports from the Stones of Far Speech that he had left with each group. Most were still traveling, and would be for some time. Michael spent the rest of the day getting in his 2 smartest and best behaved, Carlex Black and Jermaine Rich, enrolled into the city's principal university, a combination of a law school and Tir Iomde seminary, the gods of justice and law. These 2 aspects were, in fact, distinct. Michael had chosen several of this bunch because they were moderately educated. None were scientists by any means, but in all save his crackhead suicide squad, he had sent at least one person who could read in each group. But out of Carlex and Jermaine, he didn't need them to actually do any studying, just look the part enough to blend in and gain access to the several libraries on campus. Being that this was all he really needed them to do, he instructed them to go to just enough classes to keep any professors from trying to reach out to them, and to just do their best on tests and essays. Their scores didn't matter, as they would only be in for 1 semester to start with. So, through a bit of blackmail loaned to him by the DeGlades, and some of the church's own money to grease some palms at the university, the 2 got their applications accepted and attained a dorm where they could be roommates. Michael also gave them a sending stone to keep in contact, since they could rarely meet in person now to keep up their cover, even if they were only staying a few miles from each other. Michael then sent Thera Astophilis and Risque Pickney off to a similar undercover operation. They were going to get hired to work for a family that was actually some of the DeGlades' direct competition in the selling of tax-free magical items. So if nothing about the blade, or anything else that might be useful, came through the dragnet of their ally, then they might catch it on the one hand that didn't talk to the first. These 2 women had started out as rogues and smugglers. Thera mostly with drugs, and Risque had actually worked in Jorgweiser before. They were going to use that old knowledge and reputation to get them hired. The cover story was too easy, as it was mostly true. The family that Risque had been working for fell apart, and Risque had left town to run from the fallout, eventually joining Mercoul after being disenfranchised with life when hers turned upside down. Now she was back and looking for work. Easy peasy. She was just going to change the name of the Death Fists to an imaginary mercenary company to explain her new friend and new wealth of experience. Don Bradman and Loven Kahn were men both alike in dignity, skill, and age. Michael tasked them with worming their way into what was essentially the city's last-ditch effort to not be completely consumed by organized crime, as the Yorgweiser police steadily fell deeper and deeper into corruption. Or, at least, this was their last-ditch effort to look like they were trying to do something about it. These brave souls who had all sworn themselves into being the enemies of both sides in this crime war were called the Dusk Watch, just mercenaries or adventurers stupid enough to vigilante their way through the seedy underbelly of the corrupt government and the crime lords. They only answered to the mayor, who may or may not have been just such a person that they were supposed to expose and bring to justice, and honestly didn't get much done other than being an inconvenience to the people they sought to eradicate. But the pair of older men were going to offer to be trainers and mentors. Their combined 800 years of experience adventuring would surely be welcome to the shaky and fledgling organization that desperately needed the help. The others weren't going to be much further undercover than just avoiding notice required. Wake Young and Toxic were going to alternate between going to red light district bars for rumors and then black market auctions to try and listen for leads or meet any potential people they could make friends with. Then Pam and Alan, the most normal of the entire group other than that they didn't have last names, and even insisted that their fake identities not have last names, were just going to go to every public library and museum they could get into. A middle-aged couple into classical entertainment, nothing more. When Michael pressed them, they said they might compromise and give someone a middle name, pretending it was a last name, if asked by someone trying to get them to make a reservation or sign a guest book. Michael didn't have the energy to argue with them and just hoped that they wouldn't argue with anyone who asked, ordering them to practice making up cover names on the spot with Toxic. She was good at it. Toxic's real name was a secret that only Michael and Mercoul knew. The last four of them, Michael himself, Lewis as a bit of usefulness and a bit of stress relief, Stephen as a hunting dog, and then Claire as his handler, were going to be following any promising leads found by the others, sniffing out anything that might be real. While the others took a few days to a week to sort out their stories and settle into their positions, Michael also spent his time, with Lewis's help, to make a show of looking over Don DeGlade's demonic bargain in extreme detail, even sorting out some of the Ionde and Tyr law books, while also writing letters in blood to some old contacts in Hell to see if they knew anything about this devil he was supposed to be negotiating with. In this few weeks of setup, Claire helped Stephen study up on his magic sense, and while they had the others for their last few days, they spent the hours sparring in the safe house's backyard and just in communion with each other and Mercoul. Michael went out with Lewis during one of these days, off to use Lewis as a pretty distraction while Michael got some espionage work done. So with the two bossy party poopers gone again, the rest of the group happily relaxed. With their splitting up imminent, Pam, the mom friend of the group, other than Claire being Stephen's mom, pulled everybody there into a card game. There was even a fellow from the DeGlade Mafia who had come up to resupply the house that she forced into at least 2 games while he tried not to panic about being surrounded by apocalypse cultists, while also trying to ask the apocalypse cultists what they needed, something they purposefully made difficult for him. Between rounds, the man desperately tried to ask them about anything the group might want, but the more thorny members of the group, squarely Thera and Carlex, just wanted to watch him squirm, and so they did everything in their power to delay him as much as possible. The poor soldier's name was Led, and with one sweaty hand holding a pen and the other holding his cards, he tried to recover from Thera demanding he tell her his real name while she played with a knife. He maintained that his real name was in fact Led, and that it was not just some nickname that the other Mafia guys had made up for him, and that he was now using to avoid giving Apocalypse cultists his real name. He did this so much that eventually Thera just started calling off random names to see which one he would react to. Led desperately went around and begged everyone to tell him what their favorite food and drink was. A few started to give him outright disgusting or absurdly poisonous items, until Loven Khan cautioned that if that was what they asked for, they might really get it instead of something actually edible. There were groans of disappointment and acceptance had around, and Led had to frantically scratch out and jot down new requests, all in the midst of a few of them yelling at him in a way that they thought was funny, and Led pretended to laugh along to, that he was taking too long for his turn because he was so focused on just doing his job so he could get the hell out of there, and hadn't realized he was up. At last, after wiping some sweat off his brow, Led was able to ask the hooded figure sitting next to Claire, a random child he was alarmed to see was just chilling with these serial killers, what he would like. Led was then so alarmed as Stephen sat up and revealed his face that he forgot about his turn again, and it took not just yelling at, but full shoulder shaking to make the man focus on anything but the horrifying visage before him, and the punch of ancient, evil, all-encompassing power emanating from the cloaked figure. The black aura within the hooded figure stole his breath, his heart, and even his mind from him. The Mafia soldier tossed some random cards down, and after a breath to keep the anxious vomit down, he whimpered. "Hey, Stevie," Don smirked. "Stevie," Led repeated with a hearty gulp. I haven't asked you anything yet, but, what's your favorite food?" "Soup," Stephen cheered, oblivious to the horror of this stranger, to which most of the group laughed. "Saw that coming from a frickin' mile away," Toxic mumbled. Led laughed too, as much as he could, while suffocated by waves of invisible darkness, not getting the joke, but encouraged by a brief break in the teasing from the death cultists. "What kind? Warm?" Led forced a grin as he saw everyone else nodding along, indulging himself in seeing how far down the inside joke went, if for nothing more than trying to keep this softer side of the cult going, even if a salt-of-the-earth man like him could still feel the ice-cold energy radiating off the maimed man who liked soup. "What's your favorite thing about soup?" "Spoons." "Spoons?" "Yes." "Why spoons?" "People eat with spoons." "You like to eat with spoons?" "I do." Alan saw the ridiculous line of questioning for what it was, and mocked Led by asking Stephen, "Do you like to eat with your hands too?" "Anything with anything." The others laughed again at remembering the taste testing from the other afternoon, and then they furiously began urging Led to put all the disgusting foods back on the list so they could see if Stephen would eat them. "But spoons is better?" Led prompted, desperate for anything, as he scribbled over his previous scribbles. "Yes." "Why?" "People eat with spoons." "But what about yous?" "I want to be with people." A few cringed at this as they knew how deep the warg boy's feral nature went, and realizing he touched something else and upset the vibes, Led moved on to Claire after she intervened and snapped at Thera. "No, keep the fermented herring off." Thera eventually got bored, Carlex eventually got told to stop messing with poor Led by Loven Khan, and Don got Led a glass of wine so he could calm down enough to not faint on his way out the door. At eyeing a finally friendly, even if murdering face, Led couldn't help but ask, "So's that guy, Stevie, he's a rescue," Don Bradman said with the most innocent and heartwarming smile ever, while Toxic stood nearby and nodded along. Huh? Rescued him from some orcs. He was basically a very abused dog, and now he's Claire's dog. Led looked back behind him, and then to the names on his shopping list. The 12-year-old? Yep. And Steve is... a paladin, the most powerful among us other than Elder Michael. He talks to Merkul directly, at almost all times. He was probably even doing it right in front of you. The boy is super special. Our god is obsessed with him. I meant how old he was. Best guess 17? Babyface 20? Your god doesn't know? No. Huh. It's really good that you're going to be bringing him stuff to make soup with. Merkul will be pleased. Stephen really likes soup. The soldier whimpered again. Led's vision was still painted with the paladin's face. All he could imagine was the raw carnage that had been done to him, and that he could obviously cause. Now that he thought about it, the black aura of dread that was permeating the safe house due to these people's presence was weaker here in the next room. He imagined the god of the apocalypse knowing his face, this chosen one knowing his face, and he thanked every god and greater spirit he knew of that he had the good sense to continue not telling them his real name. He didn't care what anyone said or did to him. He would not enter this house again. Perhaps not even after these people left. He considered making a tithe to a goodly god's church sometime soon. He considered leaving the Deglade business to become a monk, if only to purify himself from this once safe house. The man got several pats on the back, these two enjoying his confusion and the distant, fearful look on his face. As Led gulped the rest of his wine down in one go, Toxic told him affectionately, Steve got fucked up. Steve's fucked up, and so his brain's fucked up. Had to learn a lot of things backwards, still doesn't know much. Steve says weird stuff sometimes. Steve does weird stuff sometimes. If you or any of the others come back here dropping off or anything, don't worry. We like Steve. Steve is nice. Be nice to Steve. And then she shoved him out the door. Stevie? Claire addressed him when they were bedding down for the night, before Michael got home and they were all still in a good mood. Stephen raised his only eyebrow as she started talking when no one else was in the room, and then jumped to attention as he realized that she was talking to him. He was still getting used to all of his names. Stephen, Blue, Boy, Warg Boy, Lad, Bro, Brother, Buddy, Baby, Bitch, Son of a Bitch, Dude, Sugar, Sir, Son, Steve, Freak, Fucker, Idiot, Cripple, Weirdo, Paladin, and now Stevie. It was getting to be too much. Yes? You already are a people. You know that, right? What? Claire had to jog his memory back to the soup and spoons conversation. You say I'm not. What? When? No, I didn't. You say all the time. Most people wear shoes so it doesn't hurt when they step on rocks. Most people usually eat with forks. People wear clothes in front of other people. People don't eat bugs unless they have to. Honey, no. Another name, Stephen internally groaned. Claire explained over and over how that wasn't at all what she meant, and how Stephen certainly, most definitely, was a person. Perhaps the confusion had worsened with Merkul insisting he call himself different, and never dumb. Stephen explained Merkul's divine demand for positive self-talk, and that he had known he was human, but he had also often been called a warg or a dog, and Merkul always called him a mortal. Claire realized with immense guilt in that her explaining what civilized people did just trying to explain social norms and common practices of people who were not work slaves raised in cages, that she had made him think that he was an entirely different category of creature. It only sank in properly when she told him, "Stephen, if savage evil orcs can be considered people, you are definitely a people. Do you think that McCool would give magic to somebody who wasn't a person?" He got it then, and he felt a little better about himself as they went to sleep. He liked something about his physical body now that he knew he was in fact a person, and that other people thought so too. Maybe Lewis would be his friend now that he was a people. Michael was gone, off to talk to their host and off making the dozens of other arrangements for their various other groups, so Lewis was continuing Michael's work in the Champion's stead. The boring work, that was. While he pored over dense legal texts and read through Don Luca's contract for the 100th time, he was distracted by a voice from behind him. "Oh, Lewis?" Knowing that lisp anywhere, Lewis groaned. "What?" "I want to give you this flower." Fighting a double take, Lewis finally turned, and sure enough, Claire's pet was there, holding a flower. A white giglio lily. Almost certainly one from the safe house's backyard. Lewis looked from it to Claire's pet, back to it, back to the pet. Why? It's what people do. They give other people flowers? Yes. Why? Pretty people like pretty things. Lewis was very happily aware of what he was and what he knew everyone else also thought he was, but he couldn't help but bat his eyelashes hearing the pet say it, repeating it just to make sure he'd heard right. "You think I'm pretty." Claire's pet replied just as bluntly, "I do," and then held the flower out further. Bewilderedly, Lewis took it, and then they stared at each other for another moment. Lewis couldn't help but think of every time he had made it clear that Stephen disgusted him. "I'm not going to say it back." "I know." "What the hell do you want then?" That was all. He shrugged, and then simply turned and started to hobble away. Lewis watched Stephen go all the way back to the living room, where he flopped on the floor, despite the open couch, laid the rest of the way down, and appeared to almost instantly go to sleep. "What the fuck?" Lewis found himself whispering before flicking the flower over to the other side of the table and going back to wishing he had learned all this legal jargon before he'd made his own contract with the devil. Late that night. Late into that night. Lewis laid in Michael's bed as the demon spooned him, and the cult leader's arms might as well have been warm, squishy iron bars. Lewis was relaxed, happy, the post-coital glow of being fucked silly by a 2,000-year-old man who knew exactly what he was doing and had magic demon powers to make sex something spiritual. Despite how brutish and heartless Michael had been in recent weeks, at least this was still incredibly enjoyable. So long as Michael was in a good mood when it happened. The warg boy disgusted him, and was the very reason for all the recent headache. But late into that night, Lewis was still thinking of that stupid freak and his stupid flower. It was a promising start to the most testing and enraging thing yet. They had a lead. A Merculian artifact was rumored to be at an auction. This incredible news after only 3 weeks of the mission, already more efficient than they had been in years, then even more with the help of a particularly helpful nose. In a single day, they skipped past what would previously have been a 2-week, 10-step process. Instead of investigating, stalking, heisting, blackmailing, murdering, stealing, tracking, buying, kidnapping, or smuggling, Elder Michael just brought Stephen along to the artifact's locale. They went before the sale, pretending to shop for some nearly mundane in comparison wands of clairvoyance, just to be there on a day where there would be less security. Wands of clairvoyance were commonly illegal for privacy reasons, but readily available if one just knew where to look. Innocent, simple. While Michael worked through the deal at the black market cash register, Stephen pretended to be a bored, quirky child, a role he didn't have to practice in order to master. The few guards had insisted that they look under his hood just to get a look at and search every person in the store, but they had been so horrified by how he looked that they let him put his hood back up once they were done. As he wandered around, and Michael bought him time by using his old devil tricks to squirrel around with every deal ever, they only watched Stephen just enough to make sure he didn't shoplift. Eyes wide, but not seeing much because they were still scarred by his destroyed face and hands. Stephen was able to inform Michael in moments. Other bone god. Dark and strong sword, but no more cool talking sword. Had he been anyone but God's apparent chosen, anyone other than someone his God had specifically ordered him not to harm and to in fact nurture, Michael would have filleted him alive for saying that right in front of the sales representative. But then that opened another door. Maybe, Michael told himself, Mercule had that happen on purpose because of this door tantalizingly opening where every other should have closed. This door was one that Michael was happy to sprint into after this unsurprising yet still disappointing busted lead in their quest, as it was right up his alley for his experience and was the only reason they weren't running away after Stephen said their god's name in public. This person had a powerful Vecna artifact because they worshipped the undead god. They had different goals, to be sure, but when killing people was on the to-do list, the Dark Lords of Death and Undeath often saw eye to eye. Or, really, empty socket to empty socket, as Mercule had no eyes and Vecna only had one. Semantics. But the necromancer had a plan that he was more than willing to share the glory of with these unforeseen allies. He was selling all of these magic items for the family, and saving up his commission to afford arcane materials to attain something much more powerful and worthwhile than gold. Thralls. Zombie thralls. This was no small kidnapping or grave robbing either. They were hatching a plan to acquire hundreds at once, to unleash them so they could create more, to spread them all over the city for no reason other than to cause as much chaos, death, and undeath as possible, as it was apparent that the placid people of Yorgweiser had forgotten the name of their death-right doom and the glory of Vecna. The necromancer intended to remind them. It was a recruiting missionary mission, after all. His goal was to exalt the power of the undead god, to draw those who would witness those who would join their Dark Lord in his quest for power and dominion, to show them how even the city's strongest were so easily bent by one man's power, to recruit new, still-living lieutenants for Vecna's army and new undead soldiers for them to rule over. Perhaps even a young child of Yorgweiser would be brought to their knees by the horror of the carnage, and then accept that lichdom was the perfect way to never feel helpless again. That was all old Vecna wanted, after all. To no longer fear pain or death itself. To transcend the limits that death forced on every mortal by skipping right past the end to the beyond on one's own terms. To show all mortals how to reach beyond their flesh and persist only through power. Power was the only thing that was needed in the beyond, despite the beyond being possible on Earth if one only had the will. His teaching, his tenets, was that life was only a disgusting limit, a blatant falsehood forced on mortals to make them mortals, to keep them subjugated under entities that were not stopped by death. How unfair. Those with the will could rise beyond life, beyond death, and taste more. Every zombie and skeleton risen was just a demonstration of the pale and stiff truth that weakness and clinging to the half-phase called life was what made men into slaves. Non-believers were still slaves to death. They would always be slaves to death, and so they might as well be slaves in undeath to those who did have the power to be free. Necromancers knew it was their right to use the dead, those who were too weak to do what was necessary, those who had rejected God's gifts of life beyond life and death. They had rejected all of God's gifts that would have made them one of the exalted caste. It was a blessing to rise, even as a zombie thrall. In the necromancer's own raving words, "You forgo ascension? Then fall to your knees before me as I take you to the blessed path to undeath myself. If you are willing or no, I care not. You reject your medicine, and so I, a healer that defies death itself, shall force you to take it for your own good. Then, as I have been your shepherd, your caretaker, you shall be my flock. Obey my every will. Fall upon their blades to repent and earn your salvation." Michael eventually got a word in edgewise, and he was finally able to assure the wizard that he didn't need to sell it anymore. They were on board. Merculians, mass murder, peas in a pod. Michael was happy to help, and they would help make sure the ritual went splendidly, and they would all have a party with their new lich friend after. Maybe it would even go so well that they wouldn't have to hide in the city anymore as it descended into chaos. And when they overthrew this necromancer after he overthrew the city, it would be a Merkul city in Macadia, in addition to Kashinki and Iris. Maybe even this had been Stephen's purpose. Or, at least, Michael had thought that they were all on board, and that was how it would all go. In the walk back to the alleyway that Lewis and Clara were waiting in, probably about to kill each other in the 30 minutes Michael had left them alone, Stephen said to him worriedly, "No, do this. Do not start arguing with me again." Michael seethed, all of his glee gone in a millisecond, the rage alone hotter than any hellfire. "Not apocalypse," Stephen immediately argued. "Only some death. Mean. Bad. No." Michael had only a small hair of sanity left that he used to pull Stephen out of the other pedestrian's line of sight and behind a dumpster, clutching his cloak hard enough to draw blood on Stephen's chest with his instantly forming claws, and shoving the boy into a building's brick wall hard enough to break a weaker person's bones.
Kill. We kill. You fucking moron. This serves the Lord. This serves the mission. We will fucking kill all of them. And if you say another word about it, I will tear you limb from limb. I will destroy you to a form even more broken and wretched than the orcs ever thought of making you. There will be nothing of you left, save for your ability to smell magic, and you will be in agony every moment of your life until the Lord at last allows me to kill you.
Stephen met Michael with a rage nearing Michael's own.
This is why everyone thinks us bad. Because we are.
No do this.
No hurt people. They see us make zombies, they kill all. No looking at books and magic, if good men make us and dead god witch dead. Not even win for making zombie. You just do for fun. For why? No can look for a cool talking sort of zombies. Good men kill zombies in days. Only church run in woods again and even live. Dead god witch not even strong.
This was the first time Michael had slipped up and been openly threatening. This was also the first time that Stephen had not cowered below him. It was certainly not the first time Stephen had argued something like this, but the very first time that he had gone away from apologetically convincing, and Michael had gone away from cold command. Michael had just gotten hope for once, and he refused to have it taken away. The pathetic wretch was forgetting his place, had never known his place, and for some reason, his God wouldn't let him take his own place. Respect, normalcy. Michael begged McCool for it via his rage. He begged McCool for it with the demand that Stephen prove his worth, or Michael would be done dealing with him one way or the other. There was no more being nice now that something finally was on the line. Michael hissed. He knew the boy could feel his hot sulfur breath on his cheeks, with no choice other than to breathe it.
I'll compromise. McCool is already rejoicing in this. He is the one that led us to this. The second we ask him, he'll tell you what you are. Fucking stupid and weak. I am done playing games with you. I am done coddling you. Training time is over. You will learn at last that you have no idea, and especially no say in what we do. You are nothing but a tool in my hand, and no matter how special God makes you think you are, it is only for his own benefit. Exactly like how a display of death and terror is exactly to his benefit.
Wrong, Stephen said just as intensely. But it was clear that was all he was going to say. The boy didn't even blink while they stared each other down. Michael would have given anything he had for the ability to get away with killing him right here in the street.
If you forget your place again, I will remind you, and it won't be with Claire's little flashcard games, I can assure you. You do anything to fuck this up, and you're gonna wish the orcs still had you. Don't think for a minute that I won't make good on that promise there, boy.
Stephen said nothing, only a small twinge of the eyebrow at the mention of his mother's name being said in a dark tone. And so Michael let him go, and did not look back at him, just muttering in his head about how the idiot had better know to follow him, as it took everything in his power to walk slowly so Stephen could keep up. Michael had no idea what he would do if Mercoul took Stephen's side. It was impossible. But with God doing all of this out of necessity, or quite possibly spite, the elder was terrified Mercoul would tell Michael to hold off, just to make him enraged. If Stephen said a word about this to anyone, and the Lord did in fact say, "No, bend to Stephen's will," even Michael had no idea what he was going to do. But as a demonic, ascendant form of a dark god's right hand, whatever he did was not going to be good. Heroism. Mercoul had crushed so much heroism. He destroyed it. He consumed it into his gaping jaws. He had drunk in millions of gallons of despair for millennia. But heroism. Mercoul knew that if he didn't let Michael help the Vecna cultist, then Stephen was going to feel like a hero. It wasn't a good idea to start with. Mercoul knew that Michael was being blinded by rage and terror of what he did not understand and what the god didn't care to explain to him. But even for Michael, this was sloppy. This was why Mercoul hadn't been explaining it to him. He was supposed to already know. Michael had invented half the things he was forgetting about. Stephen was right, because Mercoul had been teaching him the ways that the church was most efficient. Unseen, unheard, unknown. They would, indeed, not be allowed in any libraries or black market crime families' intel stations if zombies were running amok in the city. And that was if the wizard was able to do anything more than create a mess that a few adventurers and the city guard couldn't clean up within the week. Even if it was never traced back to them, the entire city would be in lockdown, and every person who so much as owned a knife and a bit of determination would be hunting for the dark evildoers, and perhaps even do what the very person who had tipped him off about the Vecna artifact had: confuse the two skeleton gods. Not that they wouldn't be killed on sight if discovered whether they had anything to do with the plot or not anyway. They were going to gain nothing other than the pleasure of killing, and in doing so they would lose time and resources, not to mention flagrantly risking being found out. Stephen had additional reasons for not making a scene. Not ones Mercoul cared for, but ones that he was aware of. Stephen wanted to make people like them enough to where Mercoulians could someday live in the open. This was impossible, even in Mercoul's eyes. But he let the boy have the fantasy because, just like heroism, it was incredible to feel hope. Hope. It was hope for something so silly, but it still felt so good. The light in the chest, the appreciation for even the darkest of moments, as long as one knew that there was better beyond. Heroism. Knowing all that hope was because of you. So, with the questionable plan already, and knowing how happy Stephen would feel, and subsequently make Merkul feel as a trade-off, Merkul told Stephen to keep his and Michael's conversation a secret for the good of morale, and to keep Michael from really going off the deep end. But he also promised Stephen that he would ensure Michael knew that they were not to go ahead with the plan. It was not what they were there for, and it didn't benefit them in any way outside of the brief and worthless, "Yahoo! We murdered someone." Merkul didn't even think they'd find the blade at all, truth be told. He was letting them believe that there was a chance at the blade to give them something possibly productive to do, while he continued to analyze how he felt about feeling emotions. It was what Michael had come up with, even as Merkul had meant entirely different things in recent visions that he'd given Michael, but it kept him calm, and so Merkul let him believe it. That night, Merkul gave Michael a vision of Stephen reaching for the blade, but then the blade being snatched away by a zombified hand. Merkul watched as when Michael woke up, he seemed to be in a deep depression. Lewis said something snarky to him, as usual, and Michael beat his warlock into unconsciousness before healing, and then brutally laying with him to the point where he needed to heal him again after. They repeated this process several times. If the warlock begged Michael to stop, the demon only hit him harder. He choked him or cast the silent spell when he started to scream. When Michael was finally done, the sheets of his bed were stained with blood. They were both deeply depressed after this, but Michael's rage was colder. Merkul didn't care what Michael did with his warlock, or the several he'd had over the centuries in the same sort of deal before, but Merkul did ponder the fact that if Stephen had seen what Michael had just done to Lewis, Stephen would have been enraged. After this, and the subsequent cleanup, Michael went into his books, and the warlock took one to the opposite side of the safe house, so he could pretend to read it as he tried and failed not to cry. Claire and Stephen woke sometime later, Stephen happily telling only Claire what they had avoided, and she lay back listening with more disbelief than she had previously thought possible, even compared to everything else Stephen had already accomplished. The two quietly and happily made breakfast, avoiding the sour other two by continuing to play magical memory games and sparring. In a plot born out of pain and loathing, Lewis Clark started thinking. Stephen was the first person to tell Michael not to do something, and for the demon champion to comply. It was the first time ever, as far as Lewis knew. He'd heard the jokes. He remembered the flower. The freak thought he was attractive. Everyone thought Lewis was attractive. Lewis had used his body to get what he wanted since he was 12 years old. Sure, they forced him the first few times, but Lewis eventually realized that many preferred a willing participant, and all he had to do was make himself more willing was offer, "You've already paid the pimp, but slide a little extra to me, and I'll do a little extra for you." Even when he wasn't getting paid money, he was still getting paid. Gifts, promises, protection, favors, just straight up pleasure now that he'd learned to enjoy it. Now, though, it was just at the point where he would have left anyone else, no matter what they were paying him. That was the trouble with something so valuable as free room and board, status, safety, and most of all, magic. The contract for it was airtight, and with demons especially, the loopholes only went one way. Then, where many legal problems could go away as easily as one could run away, even something so binding as slavery, Michael knew where Lewis was and what he was doing literally every moment of his life. Lewis had agreed to that deal when he was 15. He was only 19 now. He'd agreed to be Michael's for eternity, but the demon kept changing the rules. Michael might press him to a wall by his neck and threaten to tear him apart while choking him, and Lewis might tell him to stop because kinky shit wasn't part of the deal. But when the demon was really mad at something deeper than Lewis's hobby of pushing people's buttons, anything Lewis said didn't matter. Stephen made Michael so angry. They were going to be alone together, just the four of them, for months. Lewis found himself genuinely afraid of how hellish being Elder Michael's punching bag and sex toy was going to become when this was only the first few weeks and days. The way Lewis's plan was hatching, Michael would either stop abusing him after Stephen commanded that Michael stop, or one of himself or Stephen would be dead. Either way, problem solved. Michael owned Lewis's soul, so death would not be a full escape. But Lewis figured that, even if Michael killed both of them, when Michael eventually finally died, they would go to McCool's heaven, and things would go back to the beginning of the arrangement. Surely, no matter how dark the present situation was, in eternal peace, Michael would go back to his old, doting, charming self. The man Michael was now was not the same man Lewis had sold himself to. Lewis sorely missed that other man. He genuinely enjoyed that man's companionship. He had promised to spend eternity with him, after all, imagining it to be the same as getting married once upon a time. They weren't in love, and hadn't ever been, but there had been the idea of partnership, companionship, stability, and someone to rely on. Lewis was still looking forward to it, actually. He was still looking forward to Michael apologizing and making it up to him when this Stephen problem was over. This had been a lot worse than ever, but Michael making it up to him every time had almost been worth the pain before. In the past, Michael had always given Lewis anything he wanted, so long as it was feasible to get, genuine affection included. And in heaven, McCool would give Michael anything he wanted, which was all Lewis wanted. The old man wouldn't be frustrated by slow work or other people. Despite the rough patch and other smaller rough patches before, Lewis still looked forward to lounging on black silk sheets for his eternal life. Maybe they didn't get butterflies while looking at each other. But Lewis and Michael were still supposed to be each other's ride or die. As long as Michael turned back into the other man someday, Lewis still wanted to be. Currently, though, this rough patch was untenable. Lewis couldn't take the savage pounding of Michael's fists on his beautiful face, or how similarly miserable sleeping with Michael had become. A slap on the face was one thing. Breaking his ribs was another. The ward boy wanted to be a good person. The ward boy had told Michael to stop, and Michael had. Lewis didn't know how the aftermath was going to shake out, but he couldn't take this anymore, and he especially couldn't take how bad the future was going to get if nothing changed. The plan was a little unpolished. Lewis was not a details person, and he was getting close to the point where he didn't care how things turned out as long as they didn't stay the same, but the setup was going to be so easy. Michael was off being a businessman, doing business. Claire was taking a nap, and Stephen was sitting at the kitchen table. Stephen was staring into space, just as he had been for the last hour. In the dusty yet sun-warmed room, Lewis approached. He cleaned up, fully styled his hair, polished his nails, and wore a thin linen shirt that his gold scales could be seen through. Lewis leaned in close enough to where Stephen could smell the perfume he had put on, and set down his own flower. A white carnation, also from the backyard. It took Stephen longer than a normal person to come back from staring into space, but he looked at the flower, then to Lewis, back to the flower, and if he had a full face, it would have become a wide grin. Lewis sat down next to him, plopping his elbows on the table to rest his gilded hands on, and making a show of innocently swinging his feet a bit. Stephen picked the flower up and took a gentle smell of it. "It's good," Stephen said softly, rolling the stem between his remaining fingers. "You like it?" "I do." "What is it called?" Lewis's act almost failed right there as he cuttingly scoffed. "A flower, Stephen." "But flowered name." "Oh." Lewis internally smacked himself for being rude, and turned the charm way up to compensate. "It's a carnation. They're pretty fun, actually. If you put them in dyed water, they suck it up and change color." "Really?" "Yeah, and some people use them for code things. Wearing a green one means you're gay, for example." "And snow color?" "Being clean and sweet. Not like sugar, but like a baby." "Like that," Stephen smiled, nodding. Lewis was banking on the idiot not seeing through him, on being too stupid to remember how Lewis had hated him every second until now, and wondered if Stephen even knew the other situation where people called each other baby, or even what the word gay meant. If not, well, now was the time to teach him, Lewis broadly supposed. "Come outside with me? Something show? The weather's just good. I want to sit with you in the sun." Stephen lurched in his seat, eye wide, hardly able to believe it. Anyone else who had gone from being detested to being flirted with would have been suspicious, but nope, not Stevie. "Okay," the ward boy said so enthusiastically that he almost laughed. He jumped up and followed Lewis out to the shade of a large tree, the one Stephen and Claire often sparred under. Lewis had already put out one of the safe house's blankets and a bottle of wine they could share. Stephen gasped when he saw the low-effort picnic for what it was. As they sat down, Stephen whispered to Lewis, "God showed me this." The quarter dragon froze and gasped himself. even as his hand was on the wine cork. He... prophecy? About me? No tell that you do this, but that people do. The paladin blushed through what little unscarred skin he had and admitted, I ask how people tell people they want to be special friends. Show me. That why give you flower before. God told you to give me a flower? Yes. Well, not tell, but that people do that. Lewis was deeply reconsidering his plan now that he knew Mercoul was involved, and considered the implications of the god of the apocalypse telling Stephen how to flirt. He supposed then that he had already known Stephen was very unique in his relationship with Mercoul, and that if Mercoul himself was encouraging it, then it was very unlikely that Michael would be too mad at them. Or, at least, even if he was, he wouldn't be able to do much about it. Lewis felt immense pressure to perform now, and was distantly annoyed that he was apparently going to be a concubine for both of Mercoul's most favored, even if that had sort of been Lewis's plan in the first place. But with the added anxiety of God watching or not, it was almost certain now that Lewis was going to get what he wanted. I'm not directly yours, but I can make Claire's dog happy if you throw a few treats my way. He got no response, and he didn't really want any, but he forced his eyes to stop being so wide in shock and poured Stephen and himself glasses of the sweet white. He made sure to sit on Stephen's good side. No reason to look at the nasty, even if healed gore. Lewis would need alcohol for this, no matter the potential reward, but after a conviction-affirming sip, he spun up the show of the full boyfriend experience. He invented small talk, and it was pretty lacking, as Stephen had small brains, and therefore only small things to say. But Lewis was used to leading the conversation, and kept Stephen feeling like he was the center of Lewis's attention. With an apocalypse god to convince to do something, and therefore Lewis needing every ounce of pity he could get from Stephen, the story about how Lewis's parents died and the local orphanage sold him to a brothel was true, and horrified Stephen to the core. He had meant to tell Stephen this in a practiced, casual way. He had meant to give a brief summary and then have to daintily wipe a single tear from his eye. But Stephen had just been listening so intently that until Lewis's voice got so tight that he needed to pause and briefly cough, Lewis had not even realized how long or deep he had been going on about it. While Lewis confessed the darkest, most hellish part of his life, despite the fact that this was the part shortly before he became a warlock to a demon, Stephen didn't say much. The occasional grimace, the occasional soft expletive that was meant to be consoling. But he just listened. It was so addictively irreconcilable to all the other occasions of telling his tale that Lewis couldn't stop. Very few people had heard the true story, and those that had rarely let Lewis just vent. If Lewis let himself now, or during the years before he'd learned how to shove it down inside, he would cry if he dwelled on his first few working nights for even one more second than the passing thought. In only a few more words after realizing how much he had already said, Lewis forced himself to cut the tale off. Perhaps it had been the wine, but Lewis drank more of it as a step to make himself calm down. His smooth voice wouldn't stay if his throat got too tight. Not one person on Earth thought crying was sexy. He had learned that the hard way. and in ways that had made him cry over and over again. Louis was shocked he let it get away from him. He was shocked that he allowed the pain to steal his wiles and wordsmithery, especially when so much was at stake. In the aftermath of bitter silence, Louis found himself horrified at how much of himself had just been laid bare. His body was one thing, his heart was another. Stephen didn't comfort, didn't try to express pity or even to lighten the mood after Louis's heart-wrenching tale. He didn't try to further question him or promise Louis that he would help him get vengeance. Didn't even ask Louis if he was okay. Instead, Stephen replied to the 10 minutes of trauma dumping with nothing more than a dour pause, a sad grimace, and then the quiet admission, "Works. Me too. Lots of times." Louis worried that he was going to be sick. Stephen disgusted him. His wretched body, broken brain, all the trouble he had caused Louis in recent weeks. But every now and then Louis disgusted himself. Everyone who thought he was attractive never wanted to hear about the actually disgusting. Just what dirty things he could do now that he'd trained himself to be happy about it. But Stephen, the walking thorn in his side, had just let him talk. This was something even Michael never wanted to listen to, and that very morning had actually been similar to those first few nights. Louis hated that he hated the first person who had ever listened to him. And not only that, the first person who had ever just listened to him talk was a kindred soul who knew exactly what he was talking about, no matter how stupid they were. Louis had to change the subject before all of this got out of hand. Even if Stephen still didn't have much to say and knew even less words to say it with, he seemed just as happy to continue to listen to Louis talk. Only now Louis kept to much more alluring subject matter. Louis was Louis's favorite subject to talk about, and he was happy to keep talking about himself at any time, and elected to do so as long as Stephen seemed entertained. Though from then on, Louis pointedly stayed far, far away from anything that would ruin the intimate mood he sought to conjure again. Louis went on about much better things. Adventures and wild nights with Michael, his hobbies, favorite pastimes, feats he had accomplished with magic or wit or seduction that the wider world would unfortunately never approve of or know. Stephen was so simple, however, that it was hard for Louis to dig deeper into him in turn. And to make Stephen talk, he needed to dig his claws in, to make him equally vulnerable to how Louis had just made himself, to manipulate Stephen to feel even closer to him, to get so dangerously close like Louis almost just had. Though, other than their trauma bonding, there wasn't much deeper to the man. But eventually, Louis found the path to what he was after with the question, "What do you like to do?" Stephen thought for a moment and answered painfully simply, "Eat, sleep, friends, we're cool." "Claire?" "Yes," Stephen vigorously nodded. "A very good friend." And he almost smugly added, "Now you. Is there anything you want to do, but don't?" In about half the times Lewis had asked this question of other people that he'd given the boyfriend experience, they had answered, you. But Stephen was the very first in a very long line to answer, walk. Lewis looked at the legs that Stephen had used to limp out here, and Stephen clarified, walk far. He motioned to the horizon, far and far, to sea. No cage, no forever snow. I want to walk and see. Scary, everything. But not so scary anymore. Freedom, Lewis distantly supplied. And friends. Friends who also want to walk. They only want to walk to the next cursed artifact to try and kill people with it. Lewis genuinely cursed. He rarely cared, but the Death Fists did. He had to train himself not to. But all of it was painfully dull after a while, and frustrated Michael. But walk still. And Merkul say not have to kill so much. Michael angry, but he will know. You really think you can convince him to be a fucking good guy? Not make good, but lie. Act. Close enough. Lewis let out a genuine laugh, imagining someone giving Michael a star for the good boy sticker chart, even if he hadn't really earned it. I like the idea. It would certainly spice things up. Help? Talk to? You, Michael's best god friend, yes? I don't know if I'd say friend. Lewis found himself saying, without giving his body permission to say it. The young man backpedaled as Stephen's smile crossed into concerned confusion. It's different. Different from how you are McCool's friend. It is? I am... Lewis had no idea how to explain it in a way that Stephen would understand. It wasn't exactly the same, but he squinched his eyes and supposed, Michael keeps me like very, very, very nice orcs. Imaginary, very nice orcs. Stephen looked at Lewis with the deepest horror that he'd ever seen on a face before, even Michael's torture victims. He hurt you? Did you really just ask me that fucking question? Lewis snapped, checking himself for bruises again. Yeah? Stephen answered obliviously. Lewis rolled his eyes, if for nothing else than to try and hold the tears back. They came anyway, and with a vengeance when he realized he shouldn't have worried about how he was going to play this up to Stephen, to manipulate him into getting between him and Michael. Michael had been so cruel that Lewis didn't need to fake a damn thing. He honestly felt like he needed to hold back so he would stay at a verbal fight and not get himself killed by getting into a literal one. Stephen had sway, but compared to Michael, that was all he had. Not bad, not... Sometimes Lewis's voice broke off as his throat cinched tight. The demon had never tortured him, but that was a low bar to hold, all things considered. I thought you were his best friend. I am. But sometimes I don't want to be. He's really nice most of the time. I really like him most of the time, but sometimes he's really, really mean.
tired, Stephen. Help. How? How I help? Let me help.
It was such an absurd ask for something compared to the cosmos and the destruction of the universe. But even still, Lewis knew no other option than to say it.
Could you maybe ask Mercool to tell Michael to stop? Please?
A tear ran down his perfect face, and Stephen nearly tackled him into a hug.
Yes, I help. I ask right now.
Stephen started muttering even into Lewis's shoulder, and Stephen's raw strength reminded Lewis of Michael's. Warm, squishy iron bars that held him in the prison that was being held by a person he could never escape from. He didn't quite want to leave slavery, but that didn't mean his owner treated him fairly. Stephen had iron bars for arms too, but they weren't that of a prison. Maybe just the security of a handrail on a staircase. Stephen was disgusting and stupid. He was the source of all of Lewis's current problems. Mercool might be about to force Lewis to be his sex toy too. But his soft shirt was warm from his body heat and the sun. His freakish hands and face were hidden from view as Stephen held Lewis to him. So Lewis embraced his old draconian heritage and found comfort in something warm, resting his tense face on the tender and rugged shoulder and wrapping his arms around Stephen in return. The two of them holding each other for a long time.
He said he talked to him, Stephen said suddenly, breaking apart their hug with joy and just holding Lewis's clawed hands. Really? Just like that?
Yeah, Stephen said, like it was completely expected and ordinary.
We're friends.
Doing what he never thought he'd do. Lewis held Stephen's hands back. He was so overwhelmed that he kept holding one of Stephen's hands and just laid down on their blanket. After a moment of staring at Lewis's hand and his, Stephen flopped down next to him with elation. Still too shocked to think, but supposing that he should just from habit, Lewis laid his head on Stephen's shoulder. They then just laid like that for a while. Lewis expected to have to kiss Stephen. Lewis expected to have to shed a few clothes, get Stephen to shed a few clothes, and for them to have to work out the puzzle of what was going to be satisfying to both of them. Ordinarily, that would have at least happened after. Lewis glanced over and knew from Stephen's face, though, even if Lewis had brought this about in a way that was more than a bit of a downer, this was all Stephen had ever wanted from him. They stared up at the sky, the tree branches shading over them, distant sounds of the city and a far-off train. They were having a moment. Lewis had never really had a moment before. He'd given other people ones, certainly. Perhaps there had been a few with Michael, maybe. It had been close, at least. But he realized that he had never sat back and had one himself. But right now they were having a moment. And though he felt he should say something, Lewis had no idea what to say. He was so used to saying something snarky or sarcastic every time he said anything that he didn't know anything to say that wouldn't ruin this. He figured then, Stephen probably didn't expect him to say anything. Lewis supposed too, even if he did say something that ruined the moment for himself, Stephen had never been shaken by a single thing Lewis had told him before. The quarter dragon mentally shrugged, then laid his head down on Stephen's chest again. He listened to Stephen's heartbeat, trying to ignore the small rasps of Stephen's breathing, and wondered how long they should stay like this. Stephen wasn't paying by the hour, and it wasn't getting awkward yet, no matter how long it went on. Lewis imagined how they would look if Michael came back early and saw them. Would McCool stop Michael? Would he kill them if McCool hadn't talked to him yet? Lewis chose to believe that the god would, since Stephen had asked. And so Lewis also chose to relax. Difficult as it was with the idea of Michael being angry, and continued imagining what they must look like from above. Beauty and the Beast, Lewis thought to himself, for the first time in his life, making the conscious choice not to say anything at all when he could have said something not nice. Lewis knew from Stephen's mangled grin and the skip in his step that he had even while they were laying down that Stephen was considering himself to be the happiest man in the world right then. For a single moment, then, Lewis considered himself the second happiest.
Hey, it's your GM, Bailey Ford. I would like to thank our regular players, Darian, Matt, and Ian, Hip for our cover art, and Tabletop Audio for our background music. You can find us on Twitter at CIllithids, and thank you especially for listening.